why I think taking a survey of things like this is going to be a good way to start.
How long? So before we go into more analysis, let's go. I want to ask you get some more of the basics about what we're doing here. So kind of start off like. So to put this into some context, this scene, we've been to the watch store, whether that's Analog Shift or another place, and so we know that there's this idea. This scene is about introducing Decimal, introducing the name, and this is kind of what you've been working on for a while. So tell us how long have you been working on this typeface, and what is it? What is this typeface you're working on?
About 10 years ago, I had an idea that I'd buy a wristwatch. I've never worn one, but I've always liked them. They're just one of those pieces of industrial design that involves typography and mechanics, and they're just satisfying objects. And I was thinking about whether I should buy...
Hold on 1 second. Whenever you fix your collar...
Oh, is it poking out?
Just poking
yeah,
out.
That's going to happen all day. Sorry.
No, I'll try to keep my
Thanks.
eyes on that stuff.
Shall I start again?
Yeah, let's start again. I like that though. I like the 10 years ago I had the wristwatch. So tell me, like, what? How long have you been working on this project, and what is it? Introduce us to where you're at.
I had never worn a wristwatch on a daily basis, and about 10 years ago, I got it in my mind to buy one for the first time. I was thinking about whether I wanted a new watch or an old one, and it's that usual back and forth of, something new is easier to maintain, something old might be more interesting. And as I began really looking critically at watches for the first time, I noticed that there's a style to the lettering in old and new watches that's really jarringly different. A watch that's 40 years old or older has a characteristic kind of lettering on it that's really quite beautiful, whereas modern watches tend to use typefaces. Some good typefaces, some bad ones, but things that come from printing as opposed to coming from enamel watchmaking. As I began looking into this and paying more attention, I started noticing traits in all different kinds of watches I'd never seen before. There's a great kind of signature moment in almost every old watch dial in the design of the number 4, which I'd never seen but began noticing as a theme. The number 4 that every school child learns to draw has a pointy top, and the number 4 you see on old watches like these has a square top. The counter, the shape inside the character is, instead of being a triangle, it's kind of a trapezoid. And I started wondering why this one character has been kind of fetishized in this way. What about horology suggests this is the number 4 you want? The best I can guess is that in working at small sizes, a designer does everything possible to get as much air into a character as possible to make the shape legible, and in the case of a watch, certainly to stop things like the luminescence applied to the dial from actually encroaching on the shape. So in looking at watches, I began doing two things. One is the sort of smaller goal of choosing a watch to buy and to wear, but the other is thinking, is there something in this tradition of lettering that could make a good typeface? So about 6 years ago, I started working on a typeface that's now called Decimal, which is really trying to revive the aesthetic of old watch numbering. And the challenge of the project is that there's no one source. There's one watch that's nice, and this isn't all watchmakers letter things the same way. It's more, there's a kind of gestalt of old watches that's interesting. How can you abstract from that very heterogeneous collection of things a single design that can serve as a typeface?
And so that's great. That was got a good introduction of like Decimal, and that's perfect. When you're sitting here in your laboratory, detective room, what are you looking for in overall in analyzing these watch faces? What are some of the things that you're kind of trying to extract or excavate from these designs?
Well, I think the first thing to say is I really don't know. Looking at primary sources is always revealing because you see things you won't see in photographs or in literature. Watch catalogs are designed to show things off for sale, so they look sexy and clean. and books about watches don't really focus on the lettering. They'll focus on the movement, things like that. I suspect looking at things up close in person, and certainly with a scope where you can zoom in at small detail and see, physically how something three-dimensional is built up from a face, we might learn some things about how these letters are shaped and why they look this way.
Are you also interested in how they're printed on there, like the amount that they are raised or depressed? Does that come into play when you're thinking about the design of the letter form?
Yeah, it does. One of the things about typography that's so strange and fascinating is the thing a designer creates and the thing the public experiences aren't the same. They're mediated by some sort of reproduction technology. So one of the things a type designer asks is the thing I'm seeing the thing the designer originally intended? Or is the thing I'm seeing the result of the way it's made? Was there a kind of, philosophical notion of what this number 4 should look like that anticipated the buildup of enamel on a dial, that anticipated what happens when an enamel dial is heated to dry the substrate, what happens when loom is applied to the characters as well? I'm not sure. I'm curious to see what it is.
And where do you kind of where do you go to kind of collect your data? Like, where have you kind of assembled all of this group of watches? Are they from friends or shops?
Yeah.
What are the places that you can visit, you do your research at? Or something
Well,
like
I think as with anything these days, the internet is always the first port of call. There's just such incredible documentation of all kinds of things, and watch collectors seem to be very serious and very nerdy about wanting to document their private collections. There are a couple of good watch shops in the city, and their proprietors have been very generous with their time and their things. And a couple of private collectors as well who've volunteered some things that I had a chance to take a look at up close, which have been pretty revealing.
Great. So let's talk a little bit more like anatomy. So you talked about the number 4. You also had a question that you put is what other letters can we find that exhibit this behavior, and what can we abstract from them? And why are curved letters handled so inconsistently?
Yeah.
So moving on from the number 4, what's another watch that you kind of have that's interesting and in front of you that you would kind of talk about?
Well, so the watch I'm holding is this Omega 30T2, and it only has numbers, 0 through 9, and the word Omega. Nothing here really reveals what the letter R is going to look like, or the letter B might look like. In fact, nothing here even reveals whether the numbering and the lettering of the brand name are meant to be consistent. We can get a better look under the scope and see whether these things relate or not. These are a collection of watches that have different brand names with different parts of the alphabet, that have different kinds of features. Some of them have a chronograph feature, or some of them have an alarm. You'll see different indicia on each watch based upon those things. One of them has a dial for timing. I forgot what it's called. It's for timing distances. So there's a little kilometer indication around the edge. That's the first letter K I've ever seen on a watch. So this is really meant to be a good assortment of things in terms of character set, and in terms of context, and in terms of size as well. Seeing watches that have big lettering and watches that have small lettering. Seeing the very, very tiny lettering that just says Swiss at the bottom for a Swiss watch. Seeing the larger lettering on the wheels that show names of months. One of these watches is Portuguese and has the names of the month in Portuguese on it, which yields different letters than one in English or German or French. So it's really meant to be a kind of broad assortment of things to help get a sense of whether there's even an idea here. There might not be. The other possibility is this might be a more complex thing than just an aesthetic. It may be, we were talking the other day, and I described it as trying to work out a chord of the piano, and you're certain you know what this chord is, and you realize it's not just a chord, it's an arrangement of a chord in a certain group of instruments at a certain place in a theme that's taking you from one place to another, and that's more than just saying this is F minor 7. with